Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast on human capital, HR strategies against workplace fraud and corruption. So, in today's session, we welcome experts from people and culture, experts from the C suite, all professionals to listen attentively because I am with a premier from CRI Group, Anti Bribery, Anti Corruption, Mr. Fathan Al Jamil from ABAC Malaysia, who brings extensive executive experience. Together, we'll delve into something every organization cares about. Not everyone feels confident in addressing that is fraud and corruption in the workplace. It's a very touchy, it's a very sensitive subject. So today we will speak 5 areas which help HR professionals build a strategy, take the lead on anti-bribery and anti-corruption. And we know very well this is quite touchy to be stepping on people's toes, but it is a job that HR professionals have to do. So it also speaks about preventive measures to reduce risk, detect issues early, and handle cases appropriately as and when they occur. So remember, this is not legal advice, but this is practice. This is workplace education is what we are doing right now. And I would like to welcome Fathan Bin Jamil to introduce himself from ABAC Malaysia. Fathan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rifki. So, hi everybody. My name is Fathan Bin Jamil. I'm a senior lead auditor and a training specialist at ABAC Centre of Excellence based in Malaysia. So, currently, what I am doing is I conduct audits at different organizations in numerous industries based on ISO standards. And also, I also conduct trainings to our clients. That's a little bit about my background. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, everyone knows me. My name is Rifki Zamzam from the Qatar HR Forum. I am the co-founder of the Qatar HR Forum, and I would like to welcome everyone to share their comments, their inputs. And this is very important that you pause after each segment so that the lessons, the expertise shared by Fathan and myself is very, very important for you to develop policies, for you to revisit HR governance, corporate governance, and it helps you build and protect the organization and the people in the organization. So, Fathan, when people hear about fraud and corruption, they often picture finance and law enforcement. But in reality, HR is a critical line of defense because so many factors are in our control, like processes, hiring, onboarding, incentives, performance management, investigation, discipline, and most importantly, corporate culture. These are critical control points to prevent fraud and to prevent corruption. So throughout this episode, we'll be sharing the playbook, a very practical playbook for C-suite, for legal team, for HR to adapt to their organization. So starting with the first segment, what counts as fraud and corruption?
Yeah, so thank you, Mr. Rifki, for the first question. So when we mention fraud and corruption, there are similarities and differences between these two terms. So what is fraud? Fraud is an intentional, a dishonest act that can cause actual or potential gain or loss, causing economic or social harm. In addition to that, fraud can be conducted by internal or external persons to the target organization. So if it is an internal fraud, the fraud is being conducted by the employees itself of an organization because he or she has the knowledge, information about the business operation of the company. Whereas if it is an external fraud, it is being conducted or being done by somebody who is outside the organization, targeting that particular organization because he or she has personal interest to conduct that fraudulent conduct. There are few theories regarding how fraud can happen. What are the factors that can contribute to fraud? The first element is, of course, the pressure factor. When somebody has pressure, there are incentives to do something which is against the law. For example, they have a financial problem, family problem, They have working pressure to achieve their KPI, to achieve their targets. So this will lead people to conduct or to do fraud. And the second factor that contribute to this offense, I would say the opportunity. Opportunity arises when there are lack of controls, there are lack of enforcement. So when we are talking from a corporate background, maybe the organization has a very few controls, be it financial controls or non-financial controls, that can actually mitigate the fraud risks. So if you don't have the comprehensive or robust control to prevent or even detect fraud, this can always lead to fraudulent conduct. The third factor that can lead to fraud is rationalization. You see, when you have pressure and you have opportunity, then state of mind will you want to justify that the wrongdoing that you're going to do does not go against the rules and regulation, because for you it is acceptable because you think that you need it to be done for your personal gain. And other contributing factors that we may consider is competence. Yeah, competence refers to the capability of that person to do that fraud. If he or she holds a position or some position in the management, well, he can always rationalize to himself or herself that I need to take this opportunity because there's a room for me, there's an opportunity for me to do it. Right. And maybe the last factor that can contribute to fraud is the arrogance. So arrogance, refers to you feel proud of yourself. You feel that you are above the law. Nobody is watching you. And that will lead you directly to do this wrongdoing. So back to the difference between fraud and corruption. What is defined as corruption? So corruption is the abuse of entrusted power for personal gain. So you can find corruption, present in many forms. For example, corruption can be bribery. It can be abuse of power. It can be embezzlement. It can be extortion. It can be nepotism, cronyism, criminal breach of trust, and the list goes on. So you can see the corruption, is a very wide, in terms of definition, it covers a lot of elements, and even fraud can be considered as corruption as well. What is the difference between fraud and corruption? So the difference is the element of deception. So if you look into the conduct of fraud, they use the element of deception to mislead other people and to make them believe that something is true when it is actually not. So this deception element may not exist in corruption. Yeah. However, having said that, both fraud and corruption, it will jeopardize your personal integrity, because what is integrity is doing something is right even though no one is watching you, right? So if you don't have that awareness, you can be easily follow your own justification, your own mindset at that time because of pressure, rationalization, and opportunity, and for your personal gain to do either fraud or corruption. So that is how we can, understand what is fraud and corruption.
Yeah, this is very true. One thing that you said, it goes in line with corporate culture. So abuse of power that lingers with arrogance, it lingers with affecting corporate culture. You have organization and politics which plays into this. People withhold information, or they send misleading information, or they delay information, causing sabotage. This affects corporate culture. So it's important to have the corporate culture woven in properly to prevent it. And any sign of corruption, whether it is tangible like financial or hiring the wrong person, like the first signs would be political play, talking behind someone or giving misleading information. All that has to be stopped, or rather it has to be controlled, or it has to be identified, and then things have to be put in place. So thank you very much for that component. Now we move on to the second segment, which is HR preventive measures, or rather the anti-fraud toolkit which HR can adopt.
So thank you, Mr. Rifki, for the second question. So you mentioned about the HR anti-fraud or corruption toolkit that we can utilize, to prevent fraud and corruption from happening within an organization. So for me, what is important is that we conduct preventive measures. There are few preventive measures that we can undertake as an organization, particularly by the HR function. So the first and foremost, it is important that we establish and develop comprehensive and effective integrity framework within our organization, because policy will be the guidance for all stakeholders, be it your internal interested parties or even your external interested parties. So they must be guided and be governed by this policy and procedures when it comes to, commitment, when it comes to the commitment to comply with the rules and regulation of the company so that we can achieve integrity, anti-fraud and corruption culture within an organization. So this integrity framework, it should be comprehensive and it should encompass not only the internal stakeholders, but also the external stakeholders, such as our business associates. We can include the scope of the integrity framework to our vendors, contractors, consultants, joint venture partners, or any other party that we have business dealings with. So that is number one. Number two, it is important that we manage the conflict of interest within our organization. So how do we manage conflict of interest? First and foremost, we can do it by, again, establish a conflict of interest policy, or we can also incorporate this conflict of interest provision into our existing code of conduct, code of business conduct. So when we mention about management of conflict of interest, right, it requires our employees or our business associates to declare whether or not they have any conflict, actual, perceived, or potential conflict of interest in any transaction, activity, or contract, when we are doing our business dealings with different parties. So, and this conflict of interest here, it must be made aware that the requirement shall be made as soon as the commencement of an activity or when there is a conflict of interest arises. So the policy must be clear on how and when parties need to declare. Right. If we don't have this control in place, it will definitely jeopardize and compromise our effort and our initiative to actually mitigate fraud and corruption risk within the organization. And thirdly, I would say that the toolkit that HR can utilize is the personnel screening. So what is personal screening? Personal screening is that you need to conduct to the employees or even the business associates. For the case of employees, before they join the company and prior to the completion of the probationary period of that employee. So these are the stages that you can impose background screening towards your employees. So the next question, what is the aspect or criteria that we want to impose when doing this background checking? So the first one is, of course, we need to check or verify their educational background, their previous employment experience, and most importantly, the beneficial ownership of company, their civil or their criminal check, their credit check, and also maybe corruption check. So these are the aspects that you can incorporate when imposing the personal screening. And of course, again, I want to recap, you can extend this screening exercise against your business associates. So whenever you have business or associate registering as vendor to your company, or when they want to participate in a tender, you can require them to declare whether or not they have anybody within that organization that has a close connection or close associate to them. So by having these controls in place, this can, actually mitigate and prevent fraud and corruption risks within our organization.
Thank you very much. I can speak on the HR side of things. So usually, when we hire someone, once the onboarding process starts, that is when the candidate has accepted the offer letter, it goes on to the onboarding team. We ask for certificates of education, training certificates. All this has to be certified or accredited to somebody. Like, for example, now from the Middle East perspective, when we hire somebody into Qatar or into UAE, we need the attestation of the UAE Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the country's embassy. Those seals have to be there on those certificates so that we know that this is genuine or that this is valid. I cannot say if some things fall through the cracks, because if somebody wants to commit forgery, it has to be very good forgery for it to get through. But this is something that we have taken measures, and we want to make sure that we have continuous assessments that these people are aware of the work that is involved and how it connects to the qualification that they do. So assessments come into play, how they behave at meetings, how they do presentations, how they produce results come into play as well. And it has to be analyzed properly so that we don't leave room when somebody forgets or misses something. We don't accuse them of incompetence. We don't accuse them of missing out. So that is a very touchy subject for us. That's something that we have to have a very strong policy, like what you said, have an integrity framework where people own up, people say that, okay, we made a mistake, we missed something. These are human factors which we can bring to the integrity framework, provided that they are honorable enough to hold accountability. So thank you very much. It's very interesting. Now we go to our third segment. So HR governance, which is policy, procedures, and processes. Who and how should someone validate HR and corporate governance to prevent fraud and corruption?
Yeah, so thank you, Mr. Rifki. This is a very interesting question. Who should validate the HR and governance processes? As an auditor and as a trainer, what I can share is that there are few initiatives that can be undertaken by the human resource and governance function when it comes to validating these processes. The first one is, I believe that there should be a good communication and rapport between HR and the compliance function. Why I say this? Because HR most of the time is considered as one of the first line of defense with other business unit, and the compliance team will always be the second line of defense, right? So when we're talking about this line of defense, right, compliance has the roles and responsibilities to review and be updated about whatever policies and procedures that have been established within an organization. So having said that, the compliance function needs to verify whether or not these established policies and procedures has it been incorporated with anti-fraud and corruption clauses or provision into it. So by having this, right, this can actually act as one of the important controls to ensure that the measures of combating fraud and corruption can be implemented within the organization. And the second point that I want to highlight is there should be a good relationship or rapport between the HR and also the internal audit, because the internal audit team is considered as the third line of defense of an organization. So their job is, of course, to review, to assess, and to testify whether or not the current controls that are in place within an organization are effective or not. Right. So when we are conducting or when the internal audit, it is very important that we educate the whole internal stakeholders that the audit exercise should not be perceived as a fault-finding exercise, right? Rather than it is an opportunity, it's a platform for the organization or respective business units to make improvement if there are any gaps or weaknesses within their system. So this is a very important education, we need to make everybody aware about the mindset. Audit is not for fault finding. It's an opportunity for improvement session, right? And maybe the third point would be the continual awareness and training. So when I say continual awareness and training, it refers to the education, the information that HR can work together, maybe with the compliance team, to disseminate as much as information possible regarding how to report on fraud and corruption. Who are the recipient of the reports? What are the channels that can be utilized to make the complaint, and what are the policies and processes that can be referred to understand better about this fraud and corruption. So awareness and education training programs, it should be made to be, engaging and interactive, right? Maybe HR or even the compliance team responsibilities to make these programs to be consistent throughout the year. It shouldn't be conducted just as a one-off event, because we want to have a continual, consistent awareness about what is fraud and corruption and how we can contribute to prevent it. So these are the three important validations that we can impose and implement to combat fraud and corruption.
Thank you so much. And I like the part where we understand that internal communication, where it's impactful, how to understand what internal audit is. A lot of the people must understand internal audit is a protection mechanism, like what you said. It's not a fault finding. A lot of people get nervous when internal audit walks in, or even if external audit walks in. When they start asking, they end up panicking. And this has to go away. So in my previous role, I was a business process lead for a large organization in the Middle East. I was developing process. So one of the things that we always did when the process was commissioned was that once it's presented and we get a go-ahead from the chairman, we send it to internal audit officially. But then at the background, we always keep internal audit informed so that they highlight risks if we do it this way. Some things, some processes or policies make business efficient, but then is there a risk is what the question that we ask. And internal audit always gives us a heads up. Okay, you can go with this. It may happen like this. Too late to say, or it may be too early to say. It's always mentioned, or there's always a sign off before it goes in for commissioning or releasing of the policy that internal audit has signed off on this. So thank you so much for that. And now we move on to segment 4. How should HR handle allegations once there is a fraud or corruption case?
So thank you, Mr. Rifki, for the fourth segment here. How we can handle allegation. So I think coming from ABAC Centre of Excellence here, one of the ISO standards that we practice here is the ISO 37002 Whistleblowing Management System. So this ISO standard provide guidance, to us on how we can actually manage whistleblowing and also the complaints regarding misconduct or any non-ethical behavior within an organization. First and foremost, when we talk about this, how do we handle whistleblowing? It is important to note that we need to have a whistleblowing policy before HR can handle and manage the allegation made. You need to provide the platform for people to report any misconduct happening within an organization. So whistleblowing policy should be established first. So in this whistleblowing policy, it should cater not only the internal employees, but also the business associates and or management to speak up and listen up. So these are the important points here. We want to encourage people to speak up and listen up. So from there, we can detect and we can prevent fraud and corruption at an organization. And having said that, this leads to the second point, which is on the reporting channels. So under the same policy, you can, outline. Firstly, you can utilize the email address, produce the hotline. You can do the in-person meeting. You can write physical report. You can submit an online report to the compliance team. So this reporting or whistleblowing channel is are very important to be established and communicated so that people aware what are the avenues that they can utilize to speak up and share about the concerns regarding any misconduct or wrongdoing that they may face. Right. Thirdly, I think having people or the all stakeholders needs to understand when after they have utilized the reporting channel, who will actually receive the complaints. So this is what the ISO standard mentioned. You need to disseminate the information about who actually receive it because you want to create the trust and confidence among different people to use the reporting and whistleblowing channel, right? So you need to ensure at least you have two tier of functions that will receive the complaint. So usually the first party will be the compliance team because they are entrusted to manage this kind of whistleblowing. The second party that can also involve as a recipient is the HR. And the third tier that we can develop is by the one of the board of committees that can also receive the whistleblowing complaint. If you have this clear being documented in your whistleblowing policy, you can actually encourage people to speak up again and to report any fraud, corruption, and any misconduct that they may face or experience because they are guided on what they need to do. That's how HR can adopt before they actually manage, and for the consequent management depends on the criticality and the severity of the case.
Thank you. This has to be looked into from an angle of crisis management and business continuity, because depending on how big the fraud is and how big the impact is, that's something that HR, finance, internal audit, the C-suite, the board of directors have to be involved in, depending on what the case is. One of the organizations I'd worked for in the past, they had a COC at xxxcompany.com, a very confidential email address that goes to a group of VPs which formed the COC team. So the compliance was all handled by internal audit in that organization. Two people review it, two people receive it, and if the corruption or the allegation of fraud or whatever issue is from a particular department, then that department head or that VP from that who's heading that entire stream is removed from that conversation. And it's happened, it goes into a review, goes in independently, and then information is revealed to the head saying that there's something going on in your department like this. So as not to panic and not to cause a difference there, because usually in cases like fraud and corruption, we don't know to what extent it goes upstream and to what extent it goes downstream, and if it goes to external stakeholders. So that was a protection they had. And they also had protection for the whistleblower. In a lot of companies, people are often afraid to be the whistleblower. They are afraid of the ramification that people will find out, accusations will take place. And it depends on how the organization drafts the policy. Some people may say that, someone will find out that this person blew the whistle, but then these are all accusations. So a protection mechanism has to be there. This has to be handled quite carefully. In terms of HR practices, so investigations, whether it's a misconduct of the employee that has no financial impact or it has financial impact, or there are cases of fraud, there is cases of corruption, biasness, discrimination, all this comes under HR. The first thing that we have to do is HR has to contain it, make sure that the information is controlled, make sure that confidentiality is maintained to the highest order, because loose lips sink ships. Once the competitors or the public or our business partners, business associates find out that there is something going on inside this organization, they might pull back business. It puts the reputation of the organization at risk. I have compiled an article called Communication in Crisis, 6 Rules of the Road. It's on my LinkedIn, and I will drop the link in over here. One of the things that it says is control the information. There has to be a press release or a statement per incident. So it has to be captured properly. So the words have to be chosen carefully, not to mislead the public, and any clarifications must be sorted out. And it has to be given in stages as and things go on. So there are a lot of fraud cases that has happened. I mean, you and I discussed before this event as well, how it has to be revealed, what has been captured. So that transparency is important because business continuity is a top priority. And the crisis management is also top priority. So we have to protect the brand name of the organization. We have to protect the employees of the organization. Because when someone finds out that someone upstream is responsible for the fraud or for the corruption, or someone downstream has been responsible, people feel very uncomfortable because it could go against their beliefs and value system. So it's important for people to make sure that they have the full picture and let people know at a certain stage when they have the full picture that something like this has happened, the company is taking measures, company is taking actions against these people, and it will be evidence-based. People will be treated fairly with respect so that the values are not affected. And when something like this is communicated, organizations' values have to be brought into the picture when communicating. Some organizations, when there is a fraud case, there is a full-on screaming and shouting and passing blame. When that happens, it becomes very, very ugly. It becomes very toxic.
Exactly.
As management, as department heads, as experts in our own respective field, we should never be afraid to say sorry, because at the end of the day, we are human. We are doing our level best. Experience in fraud, experience in investigating says one thing about someone, but then it also has a reflection as to how we handle cases. There's always something positive. There's always something negative that's going to stick to it. So it's important for a thorough investigation, evidence-based model that has to go in, and that evidence has to be viewed from the lens of values, from the lens of policy, from the lens of internal audit, to see if this is actually the case. And if it's to do with employees, most of the cases are, basically all the cases are, HR has to be involved. HR has to take control, maybe with internal audit and business process department and the compliance departments. And HR has to lead it from my perspective. Now we come to the fifth segment. So segment 5, after a case, remediation and culture repair. How does ABAC, how does CRI group do it? What do you recommend?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rifki, for the fifth and I believe the last segment. So, very good question. What should we do, right? After maybe an incident has happened, what kind of culture that we can incorporate within an organization for us to prevent fraud and corruption from happening? What we would suggest is number one is that we need to have the corrective action plan. So whenever an incident of fraud or corruption has happened, we need to have the plan of what we need to do better to improve something has happened due to the maybe weaknesses within our own operation or system. So when we mention about corrective action plan, corrective action plans needs to be implemented, it needs to be monitored, and it needs to be maintained by specific function, depending on where did the fraud or corruption happen. So that particular function should undertake to implement, not only develop on paper the corrective action plan, the action plan actually. So when we talk about this, it also refers to, reviewing and attesting whether or not our current controls are effective. If it is not effective, so what we need to do, we need to strengthen and enhance the current control so that it can actually mitigate fraud and corruption risk. Yeah. Another thing I want to highlight that we can always utilize our risk assessment exercise. I believe maybe, most companies conduct risk assessment. Yeah, whether it's a small, medium, or multinational companies, they have this risk assessment exercise. So this risk assessment exercise should be utilized to not only detect the weaknesses within the organization that can lead to fraud and corruption, and actually we need to have the initiative to improve the risk rating. So this rating, yeah, you need to verify and again test your controls, whether it can actually combat the fraud and corruption. So it should be done meticulously. It should be monitored. You need to set the deadline for each corrective action plan. It must be specific. For example, if you say that the corrective action plan shall be, conducted in the next 3 months, you need to specify, is it 30th of July? Is it 28th of July? So timeline is very important. So this is how the compliance and HR can play their roles, to engage with relevant business associate and check whether or not they actually implement the corrective action plan. Yeah. So that's the number one. Number two is again, I would like to highlight the importance of continual awareness and training, not only to our internal employees, but also our business associates that are highly exposed to fraud and corruption. Yeah, shall be conducted again consistently throughout the year. We don't expect it to be conducted every day or every month, but at least it must be planned at a interval period of time, so that the awareness is always there, about what constitute to fraud and corruption. What are the do's and don'ts when it comes to fraud and corruption? People need to understand. Sometimes as simple as maybe $10 gift can be perceived as bribery, right? That is corruption. So we need to make our stakeholders understand, are we permitted to receive or give to our stakeholders even though it costs $10? Yeah. So it is important to understand our gift, the do's and don'ts. And I think another thing that I would like to highlight when it comes to the aftermath is actually what HR can do is sharing actual cases that have happened within an organization, right? I believe this is one, I would say, awareness that you can adopt. This is not a form of intimidation, but rather, we want to take lesson from whatever incidents that have happened within an organization. So of course, we can not reveal, the identity of the offenders and so on, However, when we share, have this sharing session on the actual cases that have happened, right? I believe the impact will be more massive rather than we just take, some news from the media, which may or may not be connected with the industry the organization is working in. That is one initiative that HR or even the compliance team. And I think the most recent case, when it comes to fraud or even corruption, on the 6th of April, whereby a bank named the National Development Bank of Sri Lanka, allegedly there was a fraud case. Actually, it has been confirmed by the authority. The initial loss due to this fraud case was 380 million rupee. And after initial investigation being conducted, it actually, the amount of the fraud case actually has risen up to 13.2 billion rupee, which is equals to, if I can check here, 450 million USD. Yeah. In a bank, when we expect the controls are in place, when people don't have integrity, when there is a lack of provision about the job scope, how we handle money, how do we operate our, business functions, with this poor enforcement of provision and poor controls, it can easily lead to these leakages. The impact is very, very massive, billions of rupees. Yeah. So I'm looking forward to read more about this case. This is the most recent case that we can study. We can actually take a lesson from those real cases that is happening in the world.
Thank you. I think that's a very interesting case, and that also tells me that we will be doing more podcasts on this subject alone. the point where, it really spoke to me was the mature organizations always allowed internal audit and HR to develop training programs on the policy, because these were compliance training that every single employee has to attend, has to fill in the MCQs, has to pass, so that they are aware of the policy and the cases that has happened. They need to be aware of what happened, how can we control this. Employees actually feel involved with that. So the culture is very important in setting that right. Once the culture is right, the training falls into place in a very beautiful way. A situation happens like this. How can we prevent? What have we missed? What can we do? So those workshops are very, very important for people to go through. That sets transparency, that sets a very interesting culture as well. Audit compliance, that is important. Management needs to meet employees, discuss this in detail, that something like this has happened, how can we take things forward, what we need to do, what to expect from the public. I have worked for an energy company before, so if anything happens in the energy sector, and I go and interact with government authorities, people in the port, in two different countries, and we always face issues. There are a lot of rumors. So how to address issues like that? Employees need to be informed, and they have to be trained on how not to provoke. So all this is there in my article. I want people to read through, and we will put the links to the recent fraud case that we were talking about in this, of that $450 million US equivalent amount. For people learn, it's very important, and thank you very much for bringing that. Now we've come to the closing of this, and I want our audience to pause, view as much as possible, and make notes. I will be doing shorts per segment and uploading it to YouTube as well, and also to Instagram, so that people can pick these. They can use our material, this particular podcast, for their internal trainings. And I encourage our viewers to reach out to myself. My contacts are there. Now, coming to the closing, again, I'm trying to close this, but this is so interesting that it's difficult for me to close. So let's recap. So HR prevents fraud and corruption by setting the expectation, the culture, the hiring, all these critical control points, including training, selection of vendors, designing rewards and recognition policies. That's our responsibility. That has to happen in a certain way. It has to be done without shortcuts. It has to be done with complete transparency. It's all to do with people's trust. How much can people trust us? How much does the management trust us? And every single initiative HR takes, finance, internal audit, legal, compliance, have to be aware of this, so that there is very little opportunity of abuse and fraud and corruption. We can minimize the risk as practically possible. If possible, we can even eliminate it.
Exactly.
So the first step would be have the controls in place, but these controls have to be communicated properly, so it doesn't look like it slows down the business. It doesn't look like red tape, but it is there to protect the business and show the public that this organization is united. It has control measures to prevent abuse, fraud, and corruption. Fathan, if you can give your closing remarks.
I would like to encode so it's important. Again, we have these policies in place. We have the controls, robust controls in place, to actually combat fraud and corruption within an organization. Awareness is always important. Continual awareness, even if you publish or develop or establish hundreds of policies, if you don't communicate them to your stakeholders, nobody knows, what the do's and don'ts, the permissible and non-permissible things that, you can undertake. So yeah, those are very important. And I think I look forward for another class session with Mr. Rifki, and we hope we're going to have more engaging and good sharing knowledge session like we have today. Thank you.
Definitely. All right. So I will drop the websites for Anti-Bribery, Anti-Corruption Group, abacgroup.com, and the CRI group, including LinkedIn, to Fathan and myself in the description below. Thank you for watching. We have come a long way in terms of our podcast, thanks to our viewers, thanks to the requirements I get from some of my potential clients. So I do appreciate if people share this, because it is beneficial for every single organization in the Far East, right through Middle East. I don't know if people have realized that we are from two different sides of the world, from
Yeah,
the
yeah,
Far
yeah.
East and the Middle East. So knowledge is universal. It applies regardless of boundaries, regardless of territory. Thank you very much. Do like, subscribe, share, and comment, and we will be happy to answer. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.